Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Collab with Kiva. I'm your host, Kiva Slade, and today I am excited to have Julee Yokoyama with me today. Julie and I actually have a shared thing in common. We are both directors of operations, but in addition to that, we're also pretty cool people, but besides that too. Okay. Julie is a small business operations consultant. She has a certification as a director of ops as well as a project manager. Needless to say, Julie's a planner, everyone, who does her homework, and she helps service-based entrepreneurs do the same by organizing and protecting their business operations. What are the results of that? Peace of mind, operational efficiency, business growth, and overall life fulfillment. With 15 years of consulting experience in both corporate and small business settings, she guides and supports her clients through the tough conversations around risk management and succession planning. So the mission critical aspects of their businesses are covered in case of emergency or extended leave. So guys, we are going to dive into this topic today of succession planning, contingency planning, things that many of us do not want to talk about. We don't want to talk about them sometimes with our friends and families about our own lives, and we definitely don't always translate those conversations to our businesses. So I want you to grab your notebooks and get ready for some really good stuff, because this is stuff that's important as we not only build our businesses, but we have a plan for how those businesses will continue in the case that something happens to us. So Julie, welcome to the show. I am so excited to get ready to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kiva. I'm excited to be here. So a little bit to narrow our focus for our conversation today based on my bio. Yeah, I really was helping my clients with business operations strategy work. And one thing that I was finding as we were going through looking at how prepared their operations were, I started asking the question, what happens to your business if something happens to you? And everybody just was a bit of a deer in the headlights. They either didn't have an answer to the question, agreed it was important, but didn't know how they could answer it. And all in all, they were looking for answers. And so then I started asking just other entrepreneurs that I was experiencing out in the world to see how much of a gap this really was. And I continually, time and time again, was not finding anybody with a clear answer or any sort of planning in place. And then started even listening to what were people talking about in the business space, small business space. And no one was really talking about anything like contingency planning and succession planning and emergency planning so I then got my wheels turning, and based on my background, I knew that I could offer a solution. And so here we are today talking about this. And this is pretty much my sole focus at this point, is to support people with covering their butts, and not only for themselves, but for their business, their families, their teams, and their clients.
Yes, absolutely love that. And I love the fact that it's our operations focus that brings us to this point. You know, when we get to see the back end of businesses and you start to see kind of how all the pieces come together, how things are interconnected, like my focus is really on data and understanding that and how that plays in. But we both had that start from, let's see what happens in the back end. And then when you start to see that, you realize, wait, even if you have all of those things in order, there are still additional parts that need to also be in order. And one of those is that level of planning that the what if planning, we'll call it, moving forward. Okay. So Julie, let's dive in. So we talked about this contingency planning, succession planning. Can you tell us more about both of those and what they mean for small business owners?
Yes. Okay. So contingency planning and succession planning are typically bigger business concepts that maybe you might be familiar with if you've worked in an office setting for a larger company. They're not typically something that's really talked about, like I said, in the small business space. So I want to break down these two concepts and give examples of what they are and how they can be seen in the small business setting and how they really can work together. So contingency planning is a course of action designed to help you respond effectively to significant future events or situations that may or may not happen. So it's plan B for how to respond to a planned or unplanned circumstance. So this can be looked at the project level with any type of project you're trying to perform, and looking at, what you have you obviously have your desired outcome, but what are alternative circumstances that could come to pass, and can you proactively plan for that? And so this is risk management, fundamentally. And so it's looking at risk assessment and then identifying what would potentially trigger that risk, and then looking at how you could potentially respond either through a prevention plan or a mitigation or contingency plan that would minimize the impact of that risk if it were to occur. And small businesses, in my opinion, can look at this across their entire operation because we're small enough for that. And that really helps us address and identify any blind spots that we might be missing in our business. And so making time for this kind of planning, it really allows businesses to have more resilience, where something may only be a drop in the bucket versus a full-on crisis.
Gotcha. And our smallness actually helps us be more nimble and being able to, kind of maybe course correct if needed, and just address those things. Because like you said, we're not ginormous, having so much in which, kind of land to cover as we look over those things. So that's super helpful. So guys, small is an advantage. Okay.
Yeah. And one thing I do want to add, because when people think of risk management, they often immediately go to a negative place. We are, pretty conditioned in this modern time to focus on good vibes only, and to focus on the outcomes we do want. And it's, that we might be manifesting something bad if we spend too much time in a pessimistic space or anything. But really, it's healthy to look at everything from all the angles, to, allow all the possibilities to kind of ruminate, as long as we don't grip too tightly to any of them. And it also can be the good things that could happen in our business, like things going too good, like, taking a vacation, like to Europe and backpacking. And that's something huge that, you really have to think about all the angles of before you choose to step away from your business that way or delegate activities. Thinking about if you did have a launch and maybe you were anticipating selling 3 services, but you had like 10 to 20 people respond with interest, how are you going to address that? And then lastly, just kind of going off of the recent nearly $2 billion lotto win that happened.
Yes.
Thinking about, something that we all kind of daydream about, right? Of winning the lottery. But, you think about having that winning ticket, and you're not just going to like immediately see the numbers pop up on the TV and then go straight to the lottery office and cash in. You have to really think about how life-changing that experience would be. And I have to say that I have researched what would happen if I won the lottery. I guess that is the project manager in me, I guess. And, you have to get a legal team, you have to get accountants, you have to get security, and you potentially have to move before you
that's
turn
really
the ticket
true.
in.
Right. Did you see the one guy who showed up in like a costume because he didn't want his family to know he had won? And it wasn't even like this huge, like it was enough money, but he literally accepted it with a costume on because he did not want his family to know that he had been the winner, because he was afraid they would become lazy. So he came in like a bird, like a costume, in order to actually collect his winnings. So there are things you have to consider, and maybe that might be what costume you wear to collect your winnings. But
yeah, and state by state, you can't necessarily you can't be anonymous. Some states require you to say who you are, and so that becomes public information. So yeah. So anyways, okay. So part two of this conversation is succession planning. And so I'm going to identify it and then talk about how this all pulls together. So it's identifying strategies for delegation of responsibilities and roles within the business. It's also a way for the owner to communicate the intentions for the future of the business if their role were to change or they were to depart the business completely. So yeah, this is what happens to the business if something happens to me. And that question, you can look at the scenarios of that as something of, I win the lottery and the business is thriving. So maybe I want to hand the reins over to someone else if I'm not interested in running it anymore. Or maybe you're reaching retirement and you want to hand it off to family members, or you want to reduce the scope of your responsibilities. And so you're starting to look at delegation strategies in that way. Maybe you want to sell your business or buy another business. In both of those cases, there's huge due diligence processes, and your role will change in that transition. And so these are things where you're going to have to gather all the information together and somehow, do some knowledge sharing. Thinking about planning for yourself or a team member to take a vacation. So these are things, it's not just about you. It's also thinking about your team and key team members. I know for me, my marketing assistant, she is having a baby in January. And so she handles, I make my YouTube videos, and then after that, I hand them off. They go through a whole process, and then my whole online presence, she has her hands involved in that. And so proactively thinking about, well, January is coming sooner than later. What does she do that I don't know how to do? And so let's start to get standard operating procedures in place. So this stuff is documented so that I'm able to step in on activities if needed. And we can plan for the best case, right? We can plan that there's minimal interruption to the business, that, she has the baby. It's great. She's full of energy and able to do all the things, but really we don't know that. So we need to think about what would happen if she does need to divert her attention away consistently for a period of time. And so planning for what that would look like, I could proactively plan my video production, getting those videos out a certain number of weeks in advance so that she can complete things before she has the baby. So there's just different ways you can kind of look at it. And succession planning, the process can really help you think of those scenarios, and then it helps guide you with how to pull information together that you would need to be able to communicate to somebody else. And then obviously we can think of emergency planning of you, a team member or a loved one has, a serious illness or injury. There's a need to go caregive for somebody else where you kind of have to drop everything and depart right away, or the elephant in the room we don't like to talk about, but it affects everyone on the planet, is death. And, unfortunately, we don't know when that time comes. And when oftentimes I hear business owners, especially solopreneurs, they'll say to me, well, I don't really think there's anything to plan for, because if, I go away, the business just kind of ends. And that's nice to think about, but really your business is a machine that you built piece by piece. And it is, if it's operating to the point where you're delivering something to clients and they're paying you in return, you have multiple pieces in place that need to be dismantled if the business were to close down. And if you're not around to do that, someone else has to. Otherwise, the business keeps incurring expenses and people are left hanging one way or the other, whether that's clients or your team members, or strategic partners, et cetera. So having, when you think about the question, what happens to my business if something happens to me, thinking about if somebody needed to come in and close the business down, worst case scenario, to act quickly, to address affairs, do I have someone identified to do that? At least 1 to 2 people? Do those
Mhm.
people know what's going on? And do they have what they need to do anything? So
Right.
that kind of gets into strategies to get started with succession planning. So I recommend, thinking of questions like that, and then thinking about, for the contingency plan, which is really what a succession plan is to that question. What happens to my business if something happens to me is the risk. And then the contingency plan is my response to this is a succession plan of, here, I'm pulling together all the information I need to give to somebody so that they can take the necessary actions. I have spoken to them. They understand. They have accepted that responsibility if and when it's needed. And they know how to access the information, because you can plan all day, but if you don't tell anybody about it, it's as if it never happened.
That's right. And if they don't have access to actually get in and do things, I think about that with something as small, it feels like is like your social media presence, someone has passed away and no one can access their Facebook account. And every single year now, Facebook's still telling us when it's their birthday. And everyone then is like, triggered because like, oh, wow, this is this, such and such's husband or such and such's father or son or, wife, mother, daughter, fill it in. But, those are the things that happen. But no one knows how to get into the account and therefore no one can actually close this down. So it's really important to put that plan into place. And like you said, even for those that are running their own business and they consider themselves a solopreneur, you're providing services, someone's paying you for services. You probably have subscriptions to various software and different tools and things of that sort that, all those things are bits and pieces that have to be compiled together and which to break back down, as you said, the machine that you have built. So I love that illustration that you gave there. So let's keep going and think just a little bit more on, we don't obviously, I think, talk about these things within the entrepreneurial community. I think a big part of that stems from, we don't like to talk about it in our own personal life either. We have to acknowledge our own mortality. But when it comes to thinking about that and just diving even a bit deeper into, it's not only the what ifs if something happens to me on a large scale, it can really be, like you said, your team member has a baby that's coming, what does that look like to put that in place? We've sort of kind of maybe possibly are somewhat near out of COVID, but for some people that was like a thing as well. Like maybe you caught COVID and you could not deliver on your services the way you had needed to, or something of that sort. I have a client who just shared today, she's having surgery in January, and she has to be like completely out, like away from the office, like not doing anything for at least the first week. She thinks she'll be able to do some Zoom things the second week. But again, you mentioned that's a best case scenario, but that's not, we really don't know how our bodies are going to respond, what our recovery is going to look like. So even for me as leading her team, that's like, ideally, you might be out a week, but the doctor's saying 3 weeks. So that's really more of what we need to dive into as to what does that look like for a 3-week period, maybe a 4-week period of you having very limited access and us having limited access to you. What needs to be in place now to make sure things continue to flow smoothly in the service to clients, meetings with clients, like do those so many different things. I think that we could start to think through as what needs to happen here so nothing falls apart, So, I think like we don't talk about those things often enough or frequently enough. And I'd love to get your perspective on like thinking of a timeline. Like if you mentioned, maternity leave in January, okay, when does someone start to think about those kinds of things within a team? Like, is there a timeline that they should think, hey, you know what, maybe 3 months out, we need to start thinking about this, ideally 6 months out. Obviously we can't, back to risk management, know all the things. If surgery happens, we might need to have that scheduled more frequently or sooner. But, is there a timeline to consider in, like what kind of steps should we actually take?
Yes. So I would think about it as how, like, as soon as possible, really, because we can gauge best case scenarios and hope for those. But if we get too caught up in the it'll never happen to me mentality, then we are putting ourselves at great risk. And the business itself, the business is its own entity. I think, especially as solopreneurs and really micro businesses, we can over identify ourselves and the business as one and the same. And so as we're building these businesses and they're producing, money to take care of us and things like that, like they really kind of take on a life of their own, and they really need to be treated with respect. And so one of those things is really thinking about how to care for the business as much as you're caring for yourself and the team and your family. And so as soon as you identify a risk, the sooner you can start planning for it, the better. But thinking about how busy is the team, who would actually be pulling that information together? What does their workload look like between now and the expected timeline of that situation coming to action, going into action, and start from there. Because you don't want to be rushed and waiting it till the end. And then you have your regular tasks to do, or maybe you have a deadline for projects or a launch, and you have all this fluttering of other activity. And then you have weighing on your shoulders that, oh my gosh, I have to get this SOP done, or, I have to document all of these things, or, write these email templates that people can send on my behalf or whatever. So the more that you can start, and I really think it's, this is a project management concept. It's look at the end goal and then break it down into chunks. Chunk it down. So from where you are, what you have in place now, to what you want to have in place at the finish line, just document, just get a scratch piece of paper, a whiteboard, if you're digital, type on there. I get pretty messy with it myself, and just write everything down that you can think of, and then go to your team members and then have them, kind of spot check and see what you might be missing, and then put it in order of priority. And I would really try to knock out the most crucial stuff first, so that if any circumstance change between now and then, the risk is minimized. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would do. But again, we get caught in the trap of, we hear stories of things happening to other people, but we don't believe it can happen to us. We'll have sympathy and be like, oh, that sucks, that happened to them. But then we just, our goldfish attention spans just kind of drift off to the next thing. And then we move on with our lives. And then we get surprised when something happens to us or someone, in our immediate environment, our immediate community. Right. So I definitely recommend that kind of planning.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I love what you shared about the business is its own entity. For many of us, it's an LLC, it's an S Corp. It is, honestly, legally speaking, its own entity that is separate and distinct from us. And therefore, it does have its own needs that need to be taken care of. It has its own level of care that we should actually give it. So I love that distinction, because that's even something like our business bank accounts. Like, if you are the only person who has that, do you need to add someone else who would have access to those in order to be able to take care of things? So making sure, again, that you list out what needs to be done, but then also follow up with making sure people have the right access, credentials, so to speak, that are needed to follow through on the steps that have already been listed out, and understanding that, hey, business is its own thing. It has its own needs that need to be taken care of. So I so greatly appreciate that distinction between the two, because we conflate ourselves and our businesses, especially when it's typically, you almost feel like one and the same. So yeah, that is super helpful. Okay. So let's see here. I think we've covered quite a few things in our way of going through this. So talk to us though about some, let's make this so practical and actionable for everyone. So what are some basic steps to get started with succession planning? If you had to hot seat Julie and say, Julie, this is my business, I need to know the next 5 things I need to do, what would Julie say?
Yeah. So I would think about scenarios. So if we look at succession planning and thinking about delegation strategies, or, just anything where there's a knowledge sharing component that will need to happen. And if you don't have anything in place, as many people I talk to don't, I would start with the question, what happens to my business if something happens to me? And then think about a couple scenarios of what could happen that would take you away from the business for a temporary or, all the way up to a permanent point of time. And then what would you need in each of those scenarios for others to be effective in stepping into your shoes? And then it's organize all of that information together, pull it all together. And then so that's plan and organize. I consider those kind of step 1. Step 2, access and awareness. So you're going to want people to take action as you won't be there. So who will be the responsible party to take action? Do they know that they are a person? Do they, are you clearly communicating the expectations? Which I just have to say, communication and lack of communication is the root of a lot of business owners suffering. We tend to have expectations in our minds of how we want things to go, or how we want our team members or clients or however to do things. But if we haven't clearly communicated those expectations or how to perform things to them, then we're setting us both up for failure. So access and awareness of making sure that everything that you've planned and organized for is accessible to those people, and that they are aware that, one, you want them to do anything at all, and that they know how to get the information they need to perform properly. And lastly, accountability to get this planning in place, because it is something you're going to want to kick down the road potentially. The day-to-day fire drills that come up are going to, be shinier in your eyes, and they're going to draw your attention away. But this type of planning is super important. And so just having an external accountability source, whether that be a business bestie, maybe that's your life partner, maybe it's someone else in the business, or hiring a professional like me to help you hold your feet to the fire, to not give up on it, to not forget about it, and to just get it done. And then it's a living, breathing thing that you can revisit at least annually and just revise on. You've already done the major legwork. And so then you just iterate over time, and then you're covered.
I absolutely love that. That's so helpful, because like you said, it is so easy to kick this down the road. It's like, hey, I'm feeling good. Business is good. We're both healthy, and just there's no need for this right now. Because like you said, there's so many other things that are just calling for our time right now. So I really love that. So speaking of, though, someone wanting to work with you because they said, hey, Kiva and Julie, I appreciate all this, but I really just don't have the time. I don't have the bandwidth. I don't know where to start. And there is no one else to hold me accountable. So I need Julie to be that person. How do they get to begin that process of working with you?
Yes. So if you're inspired to get more organized and address the question, what happens to my business if something happens to me? Then I work with clients in 2 ways on this. And one, I offer a way to just take the guesswork out of how to implement a succession plan. And that is through what I call Project CYA Essentials. And that provides you the resources and templates and guidance you need to complete your succession plan and have the resources available to effectively iterate on it over time. It's also something that you can delegate it to someone else. Like maybe you have a director of operations or a business manager of some type, but I would say that, and I help with this in Essentials, is like planning, because they're going to have to pull information out of you, right, to get it documented. So don't think that it's something that you can just hand off completely.
Right.
but yes, you can have help yeah. So we'll provide a link to that in the show notes of how to take a look at that, as well as I offer a one-on-one version where we do the succession plan, but we also take a deep dive in your whole business operation and do risk management through contingency planning for like the key critical risks we see across your business.
Awesome. Well, I am excited to share that with everyone. And as Julie shared, those details and links will be in the show notes. So make sure you check them out. Make sure you go ahead and connect with Julie because, hey, don't kick this down the can. The can does not need to go any further down the road than it is right now. In addition to that, it's really just important to, as a CEO, to step into your CEO big girl or boy pants, and do the things that need to be done for you as well as for your business. Because we'd love to delegate it off and let a team member totally figure it out. But it's almost like a will, which you just kind of like, hey, Junior, go put together mommy's will for her, or, dad's will. Like, I don't know if that's exactly the best course of action. So really taking the steps that we need to take to make sure that we think through what our business needs and make sure that I love what you said, communicate with those that we are, choosing to say, hey, I'm going to ask you to take it, and making sure that there's really that consent there, that that's a role that they want to play and they understand the details of that role moving forward is really going to be important. So thank you so much, Julie, for sharing and helping us all really talk about the things that are sometimes hard to talk about because, again, we have to acknowledge our own mortality, but are necessary things for us to consider as business owners as we continue to grow these empires, but also deal with the fact that we are mortal human beings. So once again, everyone, make sure you check out the show notes for information on how to connect with Julie to get yourself started on your project CYA, because we all need that in our lives and in our businesses. So make sure to tune in next time for another episode of Collab with Kiva. And thank you again, Julie, for being here.
Thank you, Kiva. So happy that we got to have this conversation.
Awesome.